Today we are testing out my new Sony A7C for low light video shooting. We're going to be using a variety of resolutions, frame rates and bit rates. What's up guys, my name's George, I'm a freelance video marketer based in the north of England. On this channel I share content all around tech, filmmaking and freelancing, so if that is your vibe then hit subscribe and welcome to the channel. Today we are testing out my brand new A7C. I've had this camera for just over a couple of weeks now and I am absolutely in love with it. As a previously Canon shooter coming to the Sony lineup, I have had experience with the Sony A7S series cameras and this A7 III, which I did a video on like over a year ago, my first time using it. But since I made the swap over to the A7C, I've been doing a lot of tests. I've shot a few little videos here and there, and so far I'm really enjoying the experience. One of the main reasons that pushed me towards the Sony lineup was low light performance. Although this camera isn't their low light king like the A7S series, especially the A7S III that more recently came out, it is still way more capable than my previous Canon cameras. I want to get straight into the picture profile settings and the low light tests, but first I would like to thank you guys for sponsoring today's video. A few people recently have been sponsoring me via buymeacoffee.com. You can find a link in the description to this video. If you feel like sponsoring the channel in that way, your help is always massively appreciated. If you do not, that's absolutely fine. Just remember to like this video as that helps out a whole lot. So let's look at these picture profiles. The four picture profiles I want to look at today are my custom no picture profile, my custom picture profile 1, the custom picture profile 2 that I have nabbed from Make Art Now's Josh Yeo, and then also picture profile 7, which is S-Log2. We're just going to be using S-Log2 as essentially an example of what not to use in low light on Sony cameras, because S-Log2 is made for very wide dynamic environments, from like, you know, bright sunlight to sort of deep shadows, and trying to be able to recover that information. In low light, all that does essentially is just exacerbate any noise that's already there in your shadows. The no picture profile on Sony for me essentially works the same way that I would use the old neutral color profile on Canon cameras. So what I've done on the no picture profile is go into the creative picture settings. I've selected the standard color profile, -3 contrast, -2 saturation, and -5 sharpness. These settings, along with all the other settings, will be linked in the description below, along to Make Art Now's channel as well for picture profile 2 settings. My picture profile 1, which is sort of my everyday setting, which you're looking at right now, this is it without the grade, and then here it is with the grade back on. This is essentially based on how I used to shoot on Canon. As I'm still sort of in this transition period, I don't want to like mess up my editing workflow too much, so I'm trying to make it as close to what I'm used to as possible, just in the meantime while I'm getting into the swing of the Sony things. But yes, here are the settings for my picture profile 1. So under the picture profile settings, we have black level +3, gamma is set to movie, black gamma is set to wide +1, color mode is set to pro, saturation -2, and then detail is -7. Then our picture profile 2, which is taken from Josh Yeo of Make Art Now. This one's set to black level -2, gamma still, black gamma middle -2, color mode pro, saturation -4, and detail -7. There are a couple of constant things across all these picture profiles, even though they are sort of built for doing kind of different things. The main thing you'll notice is that the detail and sharpness have all been dropped all the way down. This is because a lot of the time you can actually up your sharpness in post within your video editor, but also by dropping our sharpness, we actually reduce the amount of noise that the camera will create in its image in darker environments. Because often when it's trying to sharpen the frame, any noise that is there will become much more defined and harder to get rid of in post. You can always add sharpness in post, but you can never really take it away. As you'll probably know if you ever tried using something like Neat Video, you can sort of clean up footage, but you will lose overall quality. The no picture profile that we're using is a fairly flat profile. This picture profile 1 that I've made is sort of like a medium flat. It's a medium flat. It's a medium flat. And then the picture profile 2 that's from Make Art Now is much crunchier. Like, it's quite contrasty. So that's one of the main things you'll notice, is that the shadows are gone. Which is actually quite a good thing. Josh Yeo makes a very good point in his video, which again is linked in the description, in which he says you want to be exposing for the faces the mid-tones, like, you know, you're exposing for your subject, you're not trying to see into the shadows, which is what this color profile manages to do. So now let's look at the example footage. Before we get into comparing resolution, frame rates, bitrate, and overall ISO noise, we're first going to have a quick look at the picture profile comparisons, just to see how each of them performs differently in a low light scenario, and why we're going to use picture profile 2 for the majority of these tests. So I just shot a few little samples of me standing around awkwardly at Leeds docks. You can see here picture profile 2, nice crushed shadows. We can't see much of the potential noise in those shadows. Then picture profile 1 is a little bit lifted in the shadows, gives us a little bit more room to play with in terms of contrast, but it does bring out a little bit of noise down in the corners. Then the no picture profile that I've created is a fairly flat image, and to be honest, this is the sort of image that I'm likely to use more often in the day-to-day shooting outside in brighter weather. I'm probably going to use that a lot more. Each of these is shot at ISO 3200, and to be honest, the overall noise performance isn't too bad. Then S-Log we can see just here, and then I'll throw a Rec 709 grade on it just so you can sort of see what this would look like in post. But yes, S-Log is exactly how to create as much noise as possible in the shadows, and then you have to just deal with them all in post. So it's better to save S-Log and that flatter, no picture profile for lighter, brighter scenes, and save the contrastier picture profile 2 for the darker scenes where we can just lose the shadows and don't look back. I did some similar tests as well of just walking up and sitting down, similar to like if you were to shoot a little scene outside. The picture profile 2 just overall looks a lot better. The picture profile 1, I still think actually I'm gonna try this one out a bit more in the future because it doesn't look too bad, and we do retain a bit more detail in the shadows. The no picture profile is bordering on a log profile, to be quite honest. That's just super low saturation, super low contrast. And then S-Log 2 is a big splodgy grey mess. So it's just what it is. So the first set of comparisons that I wanted to do were a set of 4K clips, some shot at 25p 100 megabytes a second, some shot at 25p 60 megabytes a second. I wanted to see what the clarity of the image was like from the highlights through to the shadows. These first examples are shot within picture profile 2. The first shot we have of this sculpture with the man pushing the ball is a little bit more balanced. They have a bit more midtones and highlights there, so you're noticing the noise a lot less. But in the second shot, walking along the dock next to the canal, you can see in the shadows there is still quite a lot of noise. This is partly down to the fact that I was up to ISO 6400, which, even though this camera does perform quite well in low light, you're still going to be getting, you know, ISO 6400 levels of noise. The next comparisons I wanted to do were between 4K 25p 100 megabytes a second and 1080 25p 50 megabytes a second. 50 megabytes a second is the highest bitrate we can go up to with the 1080p codec on the Sony A7C, whereas 4K goes all the way up to 100 megabytes a second, but it is overall rendering a larger image. We can see here, if we punch in all the way to the left of this apartment building, just how much noise there is on the 4K file compared to the 1080p file. 1080p file performs a lot worse just in those shadows when we punch in all the way. On the 4K file, that is so much cleaner. Like, I'm actually kind of blown away. I'm shooting at ISO 10,000 here. In this scenario, I am not shooting with any of my own lights. I am just using ambient light from surrounding buildings and from street lighting. That's all I've got. I will be doing some other outdoor low light tests with this camera, but also taking along some of my own lighting, just so that we can use the low light surroundings as a nice backdrop. Then we have sort of just a back tracking shot coming along on the gimbal alongside the dock, 1080p, 25p. Yeah, I mean, that doesn't look too bad, to be fair. Actually, looking back at it now, this doesn't look too bad. And then the 4K is instantly cleaner. Like, oh my god. Both of these shots here have been at 5000 ISO, and if we look right up into the sky, in between these two apartment buildings, that's where I can see most of the noise. But this picture profile 2 does do a very good job if we're sort of looking along next to the hedges, like the little garden beds and stuff on the left. The fact the shadows are crushed off a lot more does mean that the noise is overall much less noticeable. Just temporarily, we're going to go into 1080p exclusively, and we're going to compare 25p with 50p and 100p. For the US, 24p, 60p, 120. The theory here is that as the frame rate gets higher, that the bit rate will have to split itself up among more frames per second. So we should actually see a worse performance as the frame rate gets higher. So I'm interested to see. From my brief look over before, it was actually okay. 25p still looks the same as it has done, obviously. 50p doesn't look much worse. I mean, we're at 6400 right now. No, 50p looks okay. Oh yeah, 100p. So this is very true. This was a point that Josh Yeo had made in his video. If we look up at this side of the Royal Armouries here, just in the top left and on the pavement down at the bottom, I mean, the image has essentially fallen apart. And this is down to two things. This is potentially down to the bit rate, but this is also down to the fact that I've had to up the ISO to 12,800 to be able to match exposure. I think each of these were exposed at minus 0.3 of a stop. 25p is at ISO 4000, 50p is at 6400, and then 100p is at 12,800. So it is completely understandable that we've added more noise to the scene and potentially the bit rate has been split. So when shooting in a low light and going into a higher frame rate, to be very mindful of what you're exposing for, because those shadows are gonna fall apart, like they just are. In terms of ISO performance, until now I've never really done a side-by-side 4K versus 1080p test. But doing these tests here, I go all the way up from 100 ISO in 4K to 102,400. I then do the same again in 1080p. So I'm just gonna let these roll, just watch them. Right now is the 4K. You can just see it gets to a certain point of like, this is impressive, around the sort of 10,000, 12,800 mark, where it's still pretty clean in 4K, but then soon after that, 20,000, 25,600, 40,000, it falls apart, man. It just is not a thing that you want to use. And then same again here on the 1080 tests. Whenever I've shot with Sonys in the past, it's always been in controlled environments, like shooting podcasts for companies, working with agencies and stuff like that, or testing my friends like last year out, just walking around day to day. But being able to go out and just properly understand settings, try out ISOs in low light situations has been incredible. And I'm excited to do a lot more with this camera and other Sony cameras in the future. We can see in 1080 for the ISO test, you still get pretty good performance up to a certain level. But if you are planning to shoot in low light and slow motion is not a big thing, then just try and use 4K as much as you can, because you're going to render a much cleaner image overall. But then, as we saw before in these variable frame rate tests, 50p in 1080p is still pretty passable. I mean, I think as long as you are very careful with what you're exposing for, you should have a pretty good result. But when shooting 100p, having to put your shutter speed all the way up to 1/200, and then having to bring up your ISO potentially up to where I did, 12,800, then with lower bitrate, you're just asking for noise. That is it for me today, guys. I hope you've enjoyed this video and you found it helpful. If you have, then be sure to like this video and drop a comment down below if you have any questions regarding the Sony A7C or any other tests you would like to see me do. If you'd like to support the channel, be sure to check out the Buy Me a Coffee link in the description, or subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And until next time, I'm out.